This is Russian President Vladimir Putin, and this is Chinese President Xi Jinping. If I didn't know any better, I would say these guys are best friends. Just look at them. They make pancakes together. They go on romantic boat tours together. They have caviar together. Lots of caviar. That looks disgusting, by the way. But it might be amazing. I don't know. I've never had caviar, actually. Anyway, Putin and Xi even confirmed their best friend status in public. Together, they want to overturn the current global order with America at its helm. Nothing like two besties getting up to no good. But are Putin and Xi really best friends? Like Goku and Krillin in Dragon Ball? Or more like Regina and Katie in Mean Girls? In this video, I'll explain why I think Putin deeply distrusts Xi Jinping from the bottom of his heart. And why sooner or later, China's gonna invade Russia and take over its easternmost province.
У нас такая необычная работа, которая заставляет.
Putin and Xi have a lot in common. They're both authoritarian leaders that want to expand their influence as far as possible. Both of them love bullying their neighbors. Putin invaded Ukraine while China wants to take over Taiwan. They both hate freedom of speech and democratic values, but the most important thing they have in common is their deep-rooted hate for American hegemony. You see, the United States will do whatever it can to keep other countries from becoming strong enough to threaten its chokehold on the world. This automatically brings it into a collision course with China and Russia, who are trying to carve up their own spheres of influence. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin know that their chances of undermining American dominance are higher if they collaborate. And so, in 2022, right before the war in Ukraine started, they declared a no-limit friendship. So romantic. The two best friends promised each other to do everything in their power to overturn the global political order in their favor. But underneath the surface, there's tensions building up that might lead to a conflict bursting out into the public sphere. You see, the expansionist ambitions of China and Russia overlap in some key regions, most importantly in Russia's Far East. Let's rewind the clock back to the 1850s, when China was in the middle of the Second Opium War. When it was clear to the Russians that China was losing against the French and the British, the Russians, being the absolute bully that they are, decided to seize the opportunity with both hands and threatened to open a second front to the north if China didn't hand over Outer Manchuria to Moscow. That's a textbook example of extortion. When China was at its weakest, Tsarist Russia forced it at gunpoint to hand over a region the size of Sweden in order to avoid a Russian invasion. This reminds me of that time Dr. Evil threatened to nuke Earth if he didn't get $1 million.
We get the warhead and we hold the world ransom for $1 million.
You see, the Chinese never forgot how the Russians beat them up while they were down. But from a strategic perspective, it's smarter to cooperate with the Russians for the time being, since their top priority is dethroning the United States. They can always kick their asses later. But if you look beyond the headlines and the propaganda that both countries put out, you notice that both Russia and China are preparing themselves for an eventual clash. Let me give you some examples. In February 2024, the Financial Times published an article about leaked Russian files relating to its nuclear doctrine. These documents showed the extent to which the Russians are suspicious of the Chinese. Simply put, the Russians are afraid that China might want to take back Outer Manchuria. Apparently, the Russians have been preparing for a Chinese invasion for years now, with elite military units practicing nuclear strikes on China if it ever tried to invade. Some of the nuclear-capable missiles that Russia stationed in its far eastern province are not capable of reaching any foreign country except China. I don't think there's any other way Russia could get the point across any clearer. Don't invade us or we'll nuke your ass! Meanwhile, China is in no way deterred. When it published a new map of China in August 2023, it included an island that was actually partially Russian. And the Russians didn't say anything about it, they're too busy fighting in Ukraine. With Russia being more isolated than ever since the start of the war in Ukraine, the last thing it wants is beef with its only ally, China. But who would do something like that? Who would pretend to be someone's friend while simultaneously stealing from that person? That's worse than stealing candy from a baby.
My very Milky Way! My Reese's Penis! Who's done this to me? Who's taken candy from a baby?
This is exactly how Russia took over territories from China in the 1850s. Apparently that's how it works. You wait until your neighbor is away on a business trip and then you sleep with his wife. The China-Russia alliance is just an alliance of convenience. Now that doesn't mean that the alliance won't last. It could last for a century more. But as soon as China feels as though it could gain more by dumping Russia, it'll do so without hesitation. You just know Xi Jinping is dreaming of that sweet, sweet Russian territory. I can't blame him. Outer Manchuria used to be China. Taking it back would just correct a historic injustice. But for now, the Chinese Communist Party will stay on Russia's side. The Chinese public, on the other hand, doesn't have to be as calculating about its position as the Communist Party. And so occasionally, Chinese pundits rally around the idea that Outer Manchuria belongs to China and should be returned. For example, when Putin was interviewed by Tucker Carlson in February of this year, he gave him an hour-long history lesson, going on and on about how important Ukraine is to Russia. He tried to legitimize the war by referencing the fact that Ukraine was historically part of Russia, which according to him gives China the right to reclaim it. This was enough to enrage the Chinese public, who noted the hypocrisy of that statement. Right after the interview was published, the hashtag Putin gave the first interview to an American journalist in 2 years trended on Weibo, China's version of X, reaching 6th spot and being viewed over 36 million times. Chinese nationalists were quick to point out that Russia also held territories that used to be Chinese. One Chinese national named Robert Wu noted that, according to history, Russia should return us Vladivostok and vast territories stolen 100-something years ago. Another Chinese nationalist on Weibo pointed out that Russia has territories that imperial Chinese dynasties had previously controlled, saying, "Going further afield, today's Mongolia and Russian Siberia were both territories of China in the Tang dynasty." This sentiment is largely ignored by the Chinese government, since for now it's smarter to just ally with the Russians against the West. But if Russia ever collapsed, I can guarantee you that China would be one of the many nations that would circle around its carcass looking for leftovers to claim. As soon as the Communist Party feels as though the time is right, they only need to enrage their public with propaganda about China's historical claims to the Russian Far East. If anyone knows how to deploy propaganda effectively, it's the Chinese. And this might happen sooner than you think. Since the war in Ukraine, Russia has become one of the most sanctioned and isolated countries on Earth. Not as isolated as America hoped it would be, but definitely more isolated than before the war. An economic collapse or a Russian loss in Ukraine could easily destabilize Russia, leading it to become much more internally focused, or even worse, to a civil war. In such a state, Russia wouldn't be able to defend itself as effectively as it can now. But this is all just hypothetical. Personally, I think it's a matter of time before Russia wins, which would strengthen it in the short to medium term. This would mean that China would have to wait a bit longer until it can seize back Outer Manchuria. But China always plays the long game. They're not in a rush. They don't need to do it today. But eventually, it's going to happen. So yeah, that's why I think Russia is deeply suspicious of China. And I would be too if I was in the Kremlin. But what do you think? Is China really going to invade Russia? And when are they gonna do it? Let me know by leaving a comment down below. I'm really curious about your opinion. Like the video if you enjoyed the video, and don't you dare leave without subscribing. See you in the next video.